It was supposed to be the moment Japan turned the tide of World War II. Admiral Ozawa had gathered the largest carrier force in the history of the Imperial Navy. He had the planes, he had the pilots, and he had a secret strategy that guaranteed him the first strike. But by the time the sun set over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the sky wasn't filled with the rising sun of glory. It was black with the smoke of burning aircraft. In less than 8 hours, the pride of the Japanese aerial fleet wasn't just defeated. It was deleted from existence. American pilots were so bored by the ease of the slaughter that one radioed back to his carrier, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." How did a terrifyingly powerful air force, which had dominated the Pacific for 2 years, lose nearly its entire fighting strength in a single afternoon? This is the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the day the Japanese Air Force ceased to exist as a viable threat. By mid-1944, the Empire Japan was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut that had swept across the Pacific in the early days of the war. They were a cornered animal, bleeding and dangerous. The American war machine had recovered from the shock of Pearl Harbor and was now executing a relentless strategy of island hopping, bypassing Japanese strongholds and severing their supply lines. The noose was tightening. The United States Navy, now a gargantuan armada of steel, was preparing to strike a dagger into the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter, the Mariana Islands. To the average observer, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were just more dots on a map, tropical rocks in the middle of the ocean. But to the Japanese high command, they were life or death. If the Americans captured the Marianas, the geography of the war would fundamentally change. The U.S. had just finished developing the B-29 Superfortress, a bomber so advanced it was essentially a spaceship compared to earlier models. The B-29 had massive range, but it needed a forward base. If the U.S. took Saipan, the B-29s would be within striking distance of Tokyo itself. The Japanese realized that if they lost the Marianas, their wooden cities would soon be incinerated from the sky. The logic was simple. Stop them here, or the war is effectively lost. In response, the Imperial Navy devised Operation A-Go. This wasn't just a battle plan. It was a grand, tragic summons. Japan scraped together every drop of fuel and every available hull they had left. They assembled the mobile fleet, a terrifying force that included 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, including the massive Musashi and Yamato, and hundreds of support vessels. They placed this final hope of the empire under the command of Admiral Ozawa. Ozawa was a thinking man's admiral. Cool, calculated, and highly intelligent. He knew he couldn't beat the Americans in a slugfest. The U.S. Navy produced ships faster than Japan could sink them, and American radar technology was vastly superior. However, looking at the technical schematics, Ozawa spotted one brilliant tactical advantage: range. Japanese aircraft design philosophy had always prioritized distance over protection. The famous A6M0 fighters and the D4Y Judy dive bombers were built without heavy armor plating or self-sealing fuel tanks. They were flying tinderboxes, but they were light. Because they were light, they could fly circles around the heavier, armor-clad American Hellcats. Ozawa's plan relied on the single metric. The American strike radius was roughly 200 miles. The Japanese strike radius was over 300 miles. Ozawa envisioned a battle fought like a sniper taking shots at a swordsman. He planned to launch his massive airstrikes from well outside the American radar and strike range. His pilots would take off, fly 300 miles, drop their bombs on the unaware American carriers, and then, crucially, they wouldn't return to their ships immediately. Instead, Ozawa planned to utilize the Japanese-held airfields on the island of Guam. His planes would hit the Americans, land on Guam to rearm and refuel, and then launch a second strike on their way back to the carriers. It was a strategy of shuttle bombing. On paper, it was a masterpiece. It maximized Japan's advantages and nullified the American fleet's firepower. Ozawa believed he could smash the American carriers without his own ships ever being spotted. He thought he was the invisible hunter stalking a loud, clumsy prey. But there were 2 fatal flaws in Ozawa's calculus that he couldn't see. First, the Zero was no longer the king of the sky. It was obsolete technology facing a new generation of American engineering. Second, and more importantly, a plane is only as good as its pilot. Japan had lost its best aces. At Midway and Guadalcanal, the men sitting in the cockpits for Operation Ego were not the samurai of the sky who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941. They were teenagers, rookies with barely enough training to take off and land, let alone navigate hundreds of miles of open ocean to execute a complex synchronized attack. Ozawa was bringing 450 aircraft into the fight, believing he had the upper hand. He didn't realize he was leading a flock of lambs into the most sophisticated technological trap in naval history. While Admiral Ozawa was meticulously planning a battle based on the naval doctrines of 1941, he failed to grasp a terrifying reality. The United States had spent the last 3 years completely reinventing the concept of warfare. The American fleet waiting in the Philippine Sea, Task Force 58, was not just bigger than the force Japan had faced at Pearl Harbor. It was an entirely different species of predator. When Ozawa launched his massive waves of aircraft on the morning of June 19th, he assumed the element of surprise was on his side. He assumed the Americans would only know an attack was coming when they saw the dots on the horizon. He was wrong. The U.S. Navy had turned their aircraft carriers into floating electronic brains. They had mastered radar. In the early days of the war, radar was a clumsy, unreliable tool. By 1944, it was a precise instrument of death. The Americans could see the Japanese formations forming up over 100 miles away. But the technology itself was only half the equation. The other half was organization. Deep inside the American carriers, in dark, air-conditioned rooms bathed in the glow of cathode ray tubes, sat the fighter directors. These men weren't pilots. They were air traffic controllers of war. They utilized the Combat Information Center, CIC, to track every enemy plane and every friendly fighter in real time. Before a Japanese pilot even sighted the American fleet, the CIC had already calculated his speed, his altitude, and his heading, and had vectored a squad of American fighters to intercept him at the perfect angle. The Japanese were playing a game of blind man's bluff, while the Americans were playing 3D chess with a view of the entire board. But the electronic eye of radar was just the first layer of the trap. For the few Japanese planes that managed to slip past the fighters, they faced a secret weapon that was arguably the most significant ordnance innovation of the war, the VT Proximity Fuze. For decades, anti-aircraft fire was a game of probability. Gunners had to calculate the speed of a plane, the curve of the shell, and the time of flight to make a bullet physically collide with a moving aircraft. It was incredibly difficult. Most shells simply pass harmlessly through the empty air around the plane. The United States changed the laws of physics with the VT Fuze. They managed to shrink a radio transmitter down to the size of a light bulb and stuff it inside an artillery shell. This shell didn't need to hit the target. It emitted a radio signal, and when that signal bounced off the metal skin of a passing Japanese plane, the shell knew it was close enough. Boom! The shell would detonate automatically, filling the air with a deadly cloud of high-velocity shrapnel. To the Japanese pilots, it seemed like the Americans had developed magical aim. They were flying into walls of steel that were impossible to evade. And then, waiting in the sky above the ships was a final executioner, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Japanese A6M0 had been the terror of the Pacific for years. It was nimble, elegant, and could turn on a dime. But the Hellcat wasn't built to be elegant. It was built to be a tank. The engineers at Grumman had studied the Zero's weaknesses and built a counterweapon. Where the Zero was fragile and prone to catching fire, the Hellcat was a rugged beast made of heavy aluminum, featuring self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating behind the pilot's seat. A Zero could be destroyed by a single burst of gunfire. A Hellcat could get chewed up, riddled with bullets, and still fly its pilot home. Offensively, the Hellcat was a flying chainsaw. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns that could saw a Japanese plane in half in seconds. But the greatest mismatch of all wasn't the machine. It was the man inside it. The Japanese war machine had a fatal flaw. They kept their best pilots on the front lines until they died. They never rotated them back to train the new recruits. As a result, the Japanese pilots flying Operation Ego were largely teenagers. Rookies rushed through abbreviated training programs to fill empty seats. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time. In stark contrast, the American pilots were the product of a sophisticated rotation system. The U.S. brought their aces home to teach the rookies. The men sitting in the Hellcats were seasoned veterans, highly trained, disciplined, and flying superior machines. As the sun rose on June 19th, Ozawa believed he was launching a surprise attack. In reality, he was feeding a flock of untrained sparrows into a buzzsaw. The stage was set for a massacre. At 10 a.m. on June 19th, the radar screens inside the American flagship, the USS Lexington, began to glow with a terrifying picture. A massive cluster of blips had appeared on the edge of the scope. It was Raid 1, a formation of 69 Japanese aircraft. To the Japanese pilots flying those planes, the sky looked empty. They were cruising at 20,000 feet, confident that they had caught the Americans sleeping. They tightened their formations, preparing to dive on the American carriers that they believed were sitting helpless below. They expected surprise. Instead, they found a wall of steel waiting for them. The American response was instantaneous. The order went out over the radio, "Hey, Rube," the code phrase to recall all fighters to defend the fleet. This was the moment the Combat Information Center, CIC, proved its worth. In previous battles, fighter pilots were like hunters wandering the woods hoping to find prey. Today, they were guided missiles. The fighter directors in the dark rooms of the carriers looked at the altitude of the Japanese raid and radioed the American Hellcats to climb to 25,000 feet. When the Japanese arrived, the Americans weren't scrambling from below. They were diving from above. The result wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Hellcats swooped down with the sun at their backs, screaming in at 400 miles per hour. The Japanese formations shattered instantly. The rookie Japanese pilots, panicked by the sudden ambush, made the fatal mistake of breaking formation to dogfight individually. Against the heavy armored Hellcats, this was suicide. The sky rapidly filled with the black streaks of burning aviation fuel. American pilots reported that the Japanese planes, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks, didn't just crash, they flamed up like torches the moment they were hit. In the middle of this chaotic inferno, one American pilot etched his name into history, Lieutenant Alex Vrayshew. Vrayshew was already an ace, but on this day, he was flying a plane with a malfunctioning supercharger engine that was spitting oil onto his windshield. He could barely see. Despite this, when he saw a formation of Japanese Judy dive bombers, he didn't turn back. He engaged. What followed was a masterclass in aerial efficiency. Vrayshew tucked his Hellcat in behind the Japanese formation. The Japanese pilots were so inexperienced and confused that they didn't seemingly notice the predator in their midst. Vrayshew closed in on the last plane in the formation. He fired a short, controlled burst of his 6.50 caliber machine guns. The Judy exploded. Vrayshew didn't celebrate. He simply slewed his plane sideways and targeted the next one. Boom! Another fireball. He moved to the third, then the fourth. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical. Vrayshew was conserving his ammunition, using only a few hundred rounds to tear apart an entire squadron. In a span of just 8 minutes, Alex Vrayshew shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers. As he turned back toward his carrier, he radioed the tower that he was low on ammo. When he landed on the deck of the Lexington, the ground crew rushed to rearm him. Vrayshew climbed out of the cockpit, exhausted, and grinned at the cameras. He held up 6 fingers, a photo that would become the defining image of the battle. But Vrayshew was just one of hundreds of American pilots having the same success. Of the 69 aircraft in that first Japanese raid, a staggering 42 were shot down before they even saw an American ship. The tragedy for Japan was that their commander, Admiral Ozawa, had no idea this was happening. Because most of the Japanese planes were shot down so quickly, few had time to radio back a report. To make matters worse, the radios on Ozawa's flagship were malfunctioning. He sat in his command center, staring at a map, assuming his first wave was currently smashing the American fleet. So, he did the only thing a commander in his position could do. He ordered the launch of the second wave, and then the third. He was feeding his air force into a meat grinder, wave after wave, for hours. The second wave consisted of 128 planes. Nearly 100 of them were destroyed within minutes of arriving. The third wave fared no better. By the afternoon, The American pilots were physically tired from the slaughter. The radio chatter lost its urgency and took on a tone of disbelief. One pilot was heard shouting, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The nickname stuck, but for the Japanese pilots falling from the sky in burning wreckage, it was the end of the world. They were being swatted out of the air with such ease that the ocean surface was littered with the floating debris of the Imperial Navy's final hope. By early afternoon, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had transitioned from a military engagement into something that defied logic. It was no longer a fight. It was a carnival of destruction. The air over the Pacific, usually a pristine blue, was now choked with the black, oily smoke of burning aircraft. There were so many Japanese planes falling from the sky that American destroyers actually had to execute emergency evasion maneuvers, not to dodge bombs, but to avoid being crushed by the flaming wreckage of their enemies raining down on the decks. This 8-hour period earned a grim nickname that would stick forever in the history books, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name came from a casual remark by a pilot on the USS Lexington, but it perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. A turkey shoot refers to a marksman contest where the targets are tied down or trapped, making them impossible to miss. That is exactly what the Imperial Navy had become. The disparity in skill was painfully, tragically obvious. As the second and third waves of Japanese planes arrived, the American pilots noticed something strange. The Japanese weren't weaving, they weren't using cloud cover, and they weren't working in pairs. The Japanese pilots, terrified and confused, were freezing up. These rookies had been taught basic takeoff and landing procedures, but they had no instruction on high-stress aerial combat. When they saw the swarms of American Hellcats diving on them, panic took over. Many broke formation and flew in straight, level lines, the cardinal sin of air combat. To the veteran American aviators, who had spent hundreds of hours mastering deflection shooting, a plane flying straight and level was essentially a stationary target. Some Japanese pilots didn't even try to dogfight. They just tried to run, scattering in every direction like frightened birds. Others, disoriented by the vast ocean and lacking radar to guide them home, simply ran out of fuel and dropped into the sea without a shot being fired. However, a small handful of Japanese planes, perhaps through luck or the sheer bravery of their pilots, managed to slip past a wall of Hellcats. They broke through the fighter screen and made a run for the American ships below. They likely thought they had survived the worst of it. They were wrong. They were flying straight into the Task Force 58 defensive ring. The American fleet was arranged in a tight circle, with battleships and destroyers protecting the carriers in the center. As the Japanese planes approached, the sky ahead of them erupted. This wasn't just machine gun fire. It was a terrifying wall of fire created by the new VT Proximity Fuses. The Japanese pilots were used to standard anti-aircraft fire, where you could see the tracers and jink to avoid them. But the Proximity Fuse didn't need a direct hit. The moment a Japanese plane entered the lethal radius of an American shell, the shell detonated. Observers on the decks of the American battleships watched in awe. Japanese torpedo bombers would approach, looking steady and dangerous, and then suddenly disintegrate in midair, hundreds of yards away from the ship they were trying to attack. It looked like they were hitting invisible brick walls in the sky. By the time the fourth and final raid ended in the late afternoon, the statistics were horrifying. Admiral Ozawa had started the day with the grand ambition of destroying the U.S. Navy. He had committed 373 carrier aircraft to the battle, the bulk of Japan's naval air power. By sunset, barely 30 operational planes remained. Let that number sink in. In a single business day, from breakfast to dinner, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost nearly 350 aircraft and hundreds of pilots. Entire squadrons were wiped out to the last man. The carriers Zuikaku, Taiho, and Junyo, which had launched hundreds of planes that morning, sat empty and silent, waiting for squadrons that would never return. In contrast, the American losses were statistically negligible. The U.S. Navy lost roughly 29 planes in combat. Many of those pilots were rescued by seaplanes or submarines within hours. The final kill ratio was staggering, more than 10 to 1. In the history of modern warfare, rarely had two major powers clashed with such a lopsided result. The Turkey Shoot wasn't just a defeat for Japan. It was a mathematical annihilation of their ability to fight in the air. As darkness finally fell across the Philippine Sea on the evening of June 19th, 1944, a haunting silence settled over the Japanese fleet. The roar of engines was gone. The radio channels, which had been filled with the frantic shouts of pilots just hours before, were now dead air. Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring into the gloom. He was waiting for the return of his air force. He waited and he waited, but the horizon remained empty. Slowly, the catastrophic reality began to sink in. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a demographic collapse. The true tragedy for Japan, that day wasn't the loss of machines. In war, metal is cheap. Factories in Tokyo and Osaka were still churning out A6M0s and D4Y Judas. If Japan needed 300 more planes, they could build them, but they could not replace the men inside them. A carrier pilot is not a soldier you can conscript and send to the front lines in a week. To train a pilot capable of taking off from a moving ship, navigating hundreds of miles over open ocean, fighting a high-speed dogfight, and then landing on a pitching deck requires nearly 2 years of intensive instruction. The men who died during the 8 hours of the Turkey Shoot represented the last generation of Japan's aerial elite. They were the instructors, the squadron leaders, and the promising cadets who were supposed to defend the homeland. When their planes spiraled down into the Pacific, they didn't just take their lives with them. They took Japan's entire institutional knowledge of aerial warfare. The brain drain was instant and irreversible. From this moment on, the Imperial Navy would be forced to rely on kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks, because they no longer had the time or the personnel to train pilots to actually return from a mission. Ozawa, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, finally issued the order to retreat. But in modern naval warfare, retreating without air cover is a death sentence. Without the protective umbrella of his fighter planes, Ozawa's massive aircraft carriers were nothing more than floating steel targets. They were sitting ducks in the truest sense of the phrase. The Americans, sensing blood in the water, did not let them go quietly. While the Hellcats had cleared the skies, the silent hunters of the deep, American submarines, had moved into position. The USS Albacore and the USS Kavala had been tracking the Japanese fleet for hours. Now they struck. Torpedoes slammed into the Japanese carriers. The Shokaku, a veteran survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack, was ripped open and sank. But the greatest shock came with the loss of the flagship, the Taiho. The Taiho was the newest, largest, and most heavily armored carrier in the Japanese fleet. It was supposed to be unsinkable, but a single torpedo hit ruptured its fuel tanks. Poor damage control procedures caused the ship to fill with explosive fumes. Hours after the initial hit, a massive explosion tore the ship apart, taking nearly 1,700 sailors down with it. The annihilation was complete. By the time the fleet limped back to port, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a strategic threat. They still had ships, but a fleet without eyes, reconnaissance planes, and without claws strike aircraft is useless. They would never launch a major carrier offensive again. The 8 hours of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot didn't technically end World War II that day. The fight would drag on for another year, but it decided the winner. The defensive perimeter was shattered. The Marianas belonged to the Americans. The path to Tokyo was now wide open for the B-29 bombers. The Empire of Japan was no longer fighting to win. It was simply fighting to delay the inevitable. The Japanese Empire bet everything on one massive knockout strike. They put all their chips on the table, believing that the fighting spirit of their pilots could overcome the material might of the United States. But they failed to realize that warfare had fundamentally changed. It was no longer about samurai courage. It was about radar, supply chains, and industrial efficiency. This battle changed the course of history, effectively ending the era of Japanese naval dominance in a single afternoon. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think was the biggest factor in this blowout? Was it the American technology, like the Hellcat and the radar, that won the battle? Or was it the Japanese failure to train their pilots properly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, please make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the last offensive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.